Hello, my name is Ben Hines,
I'm Zach Allen.
And I'm Kate Kinsley Brooks.
and we're doing our presentation on instruction on proper deadlift mechanics for motor skill acquisition. So to start off with our case study, we're doing it in a rehabilitation setting clinic or rehabilitation setting. Our participant is a 17-year-old male high school athlete who strained his lumbar spine or lumbar region 3 months ago. His goal is to relearn how to deadlift in a safe manner in order to avoid re-injury and to return to discus stronger than ever. His restrictions are that he must be using proper form. However, moderate to lightweight is not a concern for him at this point. His biggest fear is re-injuring his back and missing his track and field season.
So, like we said, he has a history of athletics, with discus being his primary concern. He has a moderate amount of weight room experience, and so he kind of falls under the associative stage of deadlift proficiency based off the Fit and Pausers model. Um, he kind of understands the basics of it, but just wants to make sure that he's doing everything right so he doesn't get re-injured.
All right, so moving on to the classification of the skill, the deadlift is classified as a discrete skill, meaning that it incorporates many small subcomponents, which are the setup phase, so just making sure the bar is over your feet and that you have the appropriate weight on the bar. Contraction phase, where the hamstrings fire and you start to move the bar and your body upwards. The lockout phase, where you reach the top of the movement and freeze, and then the eccentric phase, which is when you start to go back down to the ground.
All right, so the discrete subcomponents that make up that setup phase would be placing the feet shoulder width apart with the midfoot under the bar, grasping the bar shoulder width apart with both hands, and gripping the bar in an overhand motion, aligning the spine so that it's flat and making sure to avoid any flexion or extension. And then finally, pulling the shoulders back slightly in order to engage the latissimus dorsi muscle.
So the discrete subcomponents that make up the contraction phase are driving through the floor using the quads and the glutes to initiate the movement of the bar, keep the bar controlled and parallel along the learner's shins, not dragging up the shins and not going too far out, leaning too far forward, bracing the core to aid in stabilizing the spine, driving the hips to push them forward as the under the bar as it rises, and then making sure we maintain a rigid spinal orientation, so not bending the spine as we're going down to avoid that injury.
All right. And then moving to the lockout phase, we have more discrete subcomponents. So we want to make sure that our hips are fully extended. So that indicates that our glutes are engaged in the exercise. Making sure that our knees are locked out, avoiding any hyperextension resulting in further injury. Shoulders need to be pushed back in a firm orientation, controlling posture and avoiding any shrugging. And then the neck being in line with the spine again to prevent any bad form practice or injury.
All right, then the final phase, the eccentric phase, which is when you're controlling the bar down. And then the discrete subcomponents that make up this phase are controlling the hips back in a hinging motion, slowly guiding the bar down, making sure it's parallel with the knees or with the shins, slowly bending the knees as the bar descends, and then also finally returning the bar to the floor in a stable, controlled manner, avoiding any slamming or dropping of the weight.
So the motor abilities of the learner prior to injury are running, jumping, throwing, climbing, riding, and kicking, or basically anything that a 17-year-old athlete would be able to do.
And then motor abilities of the learner post-injury included walking, riding, and then some light aerobic exercise, but no really bending or twisting due to that injury. So more constricted movements.
All right, so the first learning principle that we decided to incorporate would be verbal instruction and demonstration. So the explanation for why we chose verbal instruction is because it reinforces good habits early on in the learner's mind. It aims to help prevent injury by letting the learner know the correct way to perform the skill. It also simplifies a fast ballistic movement with many fast moving parts. And then finally, it also helps to create a feedback loop for the individual, allowing them to begin to maintain an open loop controlled system. Since deadlift is a discrete fast ballistic skill, a closed loop control system is not efficient.
So for the creation of our verbal instruction, we have the instructor. He's going to give an introduction of the skill, Explain the verbal cues that go along with it, which in this case are bar over midfoot, brace core, chest up, drag up the legs, and then hips hinged on the way back down. He's going to give these instructions with the demonstration for the first 3 times, ask the learner if he has any questions, and then we'll have the learner demonstrate.
All right, and then implementing that verbal instruction, explicit learning strategies will be solely incorporated, as the use of like an implicit learning strategy could potentially result in further dangers or more injuries for the specific tasks. For example, the learner could hyperflex their spine, leading to further injury. So internally focused feedback will also be mainly used as our patient kind of has experience around the weight room and due to his athletic background, and then with an externally focused feedback being implemented if the learner begins to struggle. So kind of the funnel format will be used to identify the most critical tasks and verbal cues in the skill.
All right, so now going on to the explanation of our using demonstration. Demonstrations allow the learner to understand the degrees of freedom needed for the movement. It also helps to visualize the movement in the learner's head. It allows for the activation of the learner's mirror neurons, both while they're watching the demonstration and then also while they're performing the motor skill for themselves. And then also helps connect the verbal cues that we previously mentioned to the motor movement. And then finally, it shows proper form and pace.
So for the creation of our demonstration, we're going to have the instructor give a brief background, give the demonstration with 3 different angles for the learner so that they can see it, everything that they need to see to understand what the movement entails. And then we're making sure that they don't have any questions afterwards. And then we don't need to ask them about a limb preference here because obviously both limbs are going to be used simultaneously.
All right. Again, for implementation of our demonstration, there are going to be 3 full demonstrations with verbal cues so that the learner can view the movement both in a lateral, anterior, and posterior view upon completion of the initial introduction. So this is going to allow the learner to apply that social cognitive theory of observational learning and create that cognitive memory representation of the skill. So it will also allow for dynamic interpretation modeling to take place by cognitively grasping the coordination patterns between the limbs during the exercise.
All right, so this is our video on implementing verbal instruction / demonstration. It's going to incorporate all the verbal cues that we previously mentioned, and then also the 3 full demonstrations that the a practitioner is going to give.
And in this example, Cade is the instructor and Ben is the learner.
So the deadlift is a fundamental strengthening exercise, which is going to help target the lower extremities as well as your core and your hips. So our guy here who was injured throwing discus, this is going to help him recover by increasing his lumbar, strengthening his lower back, as well as his lower legs to prevent the injury from happening again. So, all right, for the initial demonstration, I'm just going to teach you all the verbal cues that we'll be going through. So initially, we're going to start with the bar over our midfoot. So start with the bar there, get down in a comfortable position, brace your core, make sure your back doesn't hurt. Then when you come up, with your head and your chest up, with your legs following suit, and then on your way down, make sure your hips are hinged. Alright, so just repeating that. Again, start with bar over midfoot, brace core, chest head up, legs follow suit. Once you get to the top, and hinge up the way down. And just to run through it one more time, bar over midfoot, brace your core on the way up, chest head up, legs follow through, on the way down, and hinge. Do you have any questions? No? Alright, and now we're going to have our participant try it with verbal cues.
Alright, so bar over midfoot, brace core, chest up, head up, hip hinge back.
Now we have an evidence-based article for verbal instruction and demonstration. This article talks about 2 different groups where they're measuring verbal cues and counter movement jumps. One was given standard cues about how to do the movements, and then the other one were given slightly modified cues about things that they wanted them to pay a little bit more attention such as when to swing their arms. And what they found was that the specific cues improve the performance of what they were trying to manipulate, which goes to show that when you're thinking of verbal cues, you need to be very specific as to what you're trying to manipulate in the movement.
All right, so now for our explanation on whole skill practice. So the whole skill practice approach would be the most beneficial to teach this skill because the deadlift is quick, ballistic, and a discrete movement. The complexity falls under the low side of the spectrum due to it following a simple movement pattern. It's also performed in a stable environment, which requires a relatively low amount of coordination. However, the task organization is classified as high because it involves that chain of movements, which are all dependent on one another.
All right, so the creation of our whole skill practice approach, we're going to be using simplification in order to make the skill more digestible to the learner, and in order to not overwhelm him with too much information at once. He's going to begin by using a kettlebell in order to properly learn the motor pattern. He'll then progress to a standard lifting bar with a very low amount of weight in order to begin to increase the intensity of the skill. And then he'll finally progress up to a standard bar with a moderate amount of weight. In this case, we used a 45 on each side in order to see if the skill is retained and can be transferred. He will also perform the movement in the same area in order to avoid any environmental factors that may inhibit his performance.
So for our whole skill practice video, we'll have Ben being the instructor and I'm going to be the learner. And we'll start with kettlebell and then go up to a barbell with 10-pound weights on it, and then up to a barbell with 45-pound weights, just kind of so that they can get the feel of the weight and the proper movements throughout the entire motion with different weights.
And then they'll also be going through the movements in a whole skill or whole practice approach all the way through, not doing it in parts. All right, now our patient, we're going to be introducing a whole practice method. And to start with that, we're going to be introducing a simplification strategy, which is where we'll be starting from the kettlebell here. And to do that, we're going to keep the kettlebell in the middle of our feet, still head up, chest up, bracing our core up, and then hip hinging on the way down. Do you have any questions?
No.
All right, now the participant will demonstrate with the kettlebell.
Okay, so in between my feet, head up, chest up, hip on the way back down.
Awesome. Good work. All right, now moving through our simplification process, we're going to be introducing a standard bar with light weight on it, and then I'll just demonstrate how to do it real quick. We'll have bar over midfoot, bracing core, chest up, head up, lock out, and then hips hinge back. Do you have any questions?
No. All right, let's try this. Bar over midfoot, brace core, head up, chest up, and hip hinge all the way back down.
All right, now we've reached the final part of our whole practice learning method, which is a standard bar with 45 on each side, which would be great for supporting that lumbar spine. Like before, bar over midfoot, chest up, head up, bracing core, hip hinge on the way down.
All right. Bar over midfoot, chest up, head up, brace core, hip hinge on the way down.
Awesome.
All right, and then for our evidence-based article for whole skill practice, I just chose this article by Reese that dealt with the effects of verbal cueing for high intended movement velocity on power, neuromuscular activation, and performance. So the article observed the different types of verbal cueing and their impact on those three ideas. And the study found that mentioning and organizing verbal cues for maximal movement attempts led to more neuromuscular activations that improved development of power and velocity in strength exercises. So in relevance to our deadlift instructions, the support behind the verbal cues that revolve around emphasizing the speed and intent of the movement enhance the performance and the learning of the skill, which can improve mechanics and neural adaptations down the line.
All right, and then that was the end of our presentation. Thank you so much for listening, and be sure to leave any questions in the comments. Thank you so much.